I'm hoping that you are listening to and learning about the world through the eyes of Black Agenda Report. Otherwise, you are blind. They give us provocative, informative media on a weekly basis, funded by People Power. They need our support, and they need our audience, and they need also us to share their words. So I want to start off by welcoming Glen Ford to the panel. And just to ask some questions, right? So the first question is really to think about Mumia as a journalist. Right? Oftentimes we forget the revolutionary role that he was playing as a journalist before his arrest, right? And especially the light that he was shedding on the case of the Move family in Philadelphia as being a reason why the spotlight and the target was put on his back, in addition to his work with the Black Panther Party. So being that most of Mumia's pre-prison work was as a journalist, yet corporate journalists, Black and white, do not recognize him as one of their own, right? How can we think about Mumia as a journalist, and what is the role of journalists now in this historical moment?
Power to the people.
Power to the people.
I think that we should think of Mumia as a people's journalist, and I think that's the way he thinks of himself. And he certainly has proven that with his works. In the video that you just showed, note is taken of the accolades that Mumia got as a journalist. He caught the attention of some of the powers that be in media, but it was his people's journalist, keeping track of what the police were doing to the people, in the course of which he then becomes involved in reporting the intense repression that the police are bringing down on the Move organization in Philadelphia. That, coupled with his earlier involvement with the Black Panther Party, which he left in 1970, he was still a teenager, but the rest of Mumia's career, if we could call it that, inside and outside of prison, has been as a people's journalist. And we see so few people's journalists that sometimes we don't recognize what they do as journalism. We instead give credit to these phony journalists with their concocted version of reality, not just heavily mediated by corporations, but nowadays dictated by their corporate bosses. And we call that, because it's in a certain package, we call that journalism. And yet when we see the real deal, and Mumia has been the real deal since 1970, people's journalist, we tend to classify that person as just another activist, just another person with an opinion. And that's a great mistake, because if you don't see him as a people's journalist who is methodically exposing the lies of the people in power, then you don't realize that the people in power see him that way. And the defense of him will not be solid on. So that's what I like to focus on Mumia as a journalist. I think that Mumia is such a singular figure. He is our most famous political prisoner. But not because he is singularly heroic. He is heroic, of course, but all of our political prisoners are heroic, and most of them come from the Black Panther Party. Mumia is a singular figure because he has found ways, even in incarceration, and he found these ways with the help of the movement, of course, but he found ways to continue his journalistic dialogue with the people. When you were listening to him this afternoon, that was a journalistic dialogue with the people. That was not just someone giving a speech. He always talks as someone who is providing facts that people need, information for liberation. That's what a people's journalist does. And he's been doing this since 1970. In addition to that, he's written 10 books behind the prison walls. He wrote 7 of those books while he was on death row. He didn't get off death row till 2011. His latest book, which he co-authored with Stephen Vittoria, is a monumental tour de force. It is a dissection of the Imperial Project. It's called Murder Incorporated, Empire, Genocide, and Manifest Destiny, Dreaming of Empire. Vittoria and Mumia say that they're going to turn out several more versions of this book. And this book ought to be part of school curriculums. But if we have any freedom schools and liberation schools in the making, it certainly ought to be part of that curriculum. And they should be called, I'm talking about Vittoria and Mumia, people's historians. We need to recognize when people are doing the people's work and give them their props, as well as support them monetarily. And of course, since 1994, Mumia has been producing a steady stream of commentaries and analyses on prison radio. Mumia has been a journalist and a people's intellectual for all of his adult life. Now, it should be said that every Black Panther was targeted by the FBI and the cops. And that after leaving the Panther Party in 1970, while he was still a teenager, Mumia's escalating conflicts with the Philadelphia police were as a journalist. They knew that he was a Black Panther, but those conflicts were conflicts that were created because of his journalistic work. He used the radio airwaves to shine a light on the police repression of Black folks in Philadelphia, and as I said, especially the repression that was coming down on the MOVE organization. It is because he was such an effective people's journalist that the police put him in their crosshairs, upped his category of danger to the order, and that they ultimately framed him for killing a cop in 1981. I've emphasized over and over again Mumia as a journalist, and that's because that is what most of his life's work has been. His journalism is not the kind that is tolerated by the racist capitalist state or by its enforcers in the police and the other security apparatus. It is because the state is hostile to journalism in the service of the people that the Black misleadership class also attempts to delegitimize journalism every chance they get. And the Black misleadership class are those motherfuckers that Pam was talking about earlier, and they deserve every motherfucker they get.
That's right.
So, despite the fact that Mumia was a co-founder of the Philadelphia chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists, these bourgeois corporate news readers and writers turned their backs on Mumia when the state decided that it was going to destroy him. Back in 1995, which is about the time that Mumia was scheduled to be executed, the NABJ was about to hold its national conference in Philadelphia. And that conference was going to be hosted by Mumia's old comrades in the Philadelphia chapter of the Association of Black Journalists, of which he had been president and he was a co-founder. If these people had had their way, Mumia would have been executed during the time that the NABJ was holding its convention in Philadelphia. And yet these cowardly and corrupt status seekers who call themselves journalists, these corporate ass kissers, refused to say a word at their national convention about their condemned comrades' plight. And these people had worked with him and built an organization with him. They claimed that Mumia's pending execution was a criminal matter and that it had nothing to do with journalism. Back at that time, I wrote an article for the local black newspaper in Philadelphia condemning the NABJ, but I was not surprised at their treachery. I also was a co-founder of an association of black journalists chapter. This one was in Washington, D.C. A lot before that, in 1975. When the call first came out from Chicago, Chicago was the first place where an association of black journalists was formed. But in 1975, Chicago sent out a call across the country asking black journalists in the various cities to attempt to form new chapters of the Association of Black Journalists. And when I heard that, I herded all the black journalists from the print media, from broadcasting, everybody I could find. I coerced and hectored them to come into this Association of Black Journalists. But it soon became apparent in Washington that the organization was coming under the domination of the black folks in the corporate media. That is, the black writers at the Washington Post and the talking heads at the local television station. And they believed that the Association of Black Journalists' mission was to promote the careers of black folks who work in white media. That is, to get more black people working in white media and to get promotions for those who are already working, but that was it. More like a guild of blacks with a job in white media. They didn't feel any obligation to defend the black community at large. They felt no obligation to make a critique of the editorial stance that was taken by their corporate masters. That's because for them, journalism is just a job that brings prestige, that brings money, that brings entree, that gets you into the right restaurants, but they reject the whole idea that being a black journalist carries with it any kind of social responsibility to the community at large or to black people in particular. They reject that. They think that because they're on the air or they have a byline, they actually are a treasure, a prize, and we are supposed to feel good that they are enjoying all of this prestige. What that experience, and I was 25 at that time, what that experience taught me is that most of these black corporate journalists are not assets to the struggle. They should not be considered assets because they're there at ABC or there at the New York Times. In fact, they are enemies and adversaries, as Mumia found out in the most horrific of ways in 1995 when they were going to let him fry. The presence of these people on the air and their bylines in newspapers and magazines changes very little, if anything, in terms of the editorial content of those television stations and those newspapers. How they present the world is not changed much, if any, by the presence of these Negroes. But their presence does tend to legitimize the lies that are told on that corporate media in the eyes of black people. Black people see a black face telling a lie, they are more prone to believe it. When that black face didn't even write the lie, somebody else did, and they all read the same lie. I don't see how that is any asset to us, and in fact, it is a real debit to us if our people tend to believe those black faces in those television places more than they believe the white liars. So I was through after that experience with corporate media and with the black folks who worked for corporate media. But then a few years later, it was 1980 or 81, I can't remember which one, I found myself at a party in Philadelphia at a house of some black reporter for corporate media. It was a very depressing event, and then suddenly this young man came up and he started a conversation with me. And then I realized that this was this Mumia guy who all my leftish friends were saying that I should meet. And so this is not much of a story. We only spoke for about 3 minutes, but it was the best part of that party. And it wasn't too long after that I remember hearing that Mumia had been charged with killing that cop. I got a chance to visit with Mumia a couple of months ago at the prison in Pennsylvania. And we talked for a couple of hours. We mostly talked about radio news because that had been our common experience. And he gets really animated recounting his experiences there. Again, it's important to see Mumia as a journalist so that he can't be dismissed as just another activist with an opinion. We have a whole big room of activists, a very intelligent room it is, with opinions. But not all of us are journalists and know how to organize that information so that it is serviceable to the people. At the beginning of this talk, I spoke of Mumia's political career, how in fact it has spanned the period from when we actually did have a grassroots, vibrant, socialist, internationalist, conscious, and effective movement in the country. A movement that actually did free Angela, and did free Bobby, and did free Cuba. And then we came to a period, a very long period, approaching 2 generations long, in which we couldn't free anybody at all. And finally we've come, we think, after 2014, to a new stage in our struggle, where there are signs that a new movement may be stirring. I'm optimistic about that. But the movement that used to be was mainly crushed by state repression. But an emerging class of black collaborators was eager to keep that old movement buried. Because when the state crushed the Stokeleys, the Hueys, killed Malcolm and King, and marginalized and finally neutralized the Panther Party, those collaborators had the whole game to themselves. And they were off to the races, off to the corporate boardrooms, off to the high places in the Democratic Party. So they are quite happy to see a quiescent, movement-free political scene in Black America, and they're quite upset that there's a possibility of a new movement coming into being. These are basically collaborators with the powers that be. And collaborators hate and fear those who speak truth to power. That's right. That's why the Philadelphia Association of Black Journalists we're glad to see Mumia on the verge of execution. If we are going to rebuild a movement that is capable of freeing Mumia and of freeing all political prisoners, we'll have to do it over the politically dead bodies of that black misleadership class. They stand in our way at every juncture when we try to organize in the black community. Our people's instincts are correct. They have freedom on their minds, but they get waylaid by this corporate collaborator class, which of course, being collaborators, has all the facilities of the corporate powers at their disposal. We are expected to celebrate that the Congressional Black Caucus is getting bigger and bigger. I think they have like 5 new members after these recent elections. But what the truth is that the bigger the Congressional Black Caucus gets, the worse that it gets.
That's right. That's right.
Back in 2014, in June, and that's only 2 months before Mike Brown was shot down by the cop in Ferguson, Missouri. Back in 2014, 80% of the Congressional Black Caucus voted to continue the infamous Pentagon 1033 program, which is the program that funnels Pentagon weapons and gear and training to local police. That is 4 out of 5 of the black members of Congress voted to continue the main program of militarization of the police. People don't know it, but President Obama increased the 1033 program 24-fold. That is, he spent 24 times as much money on the militarization of the police as George Bush did before him. And yet we think in terms of, oh, it's the Republicans who are militarizing the police. No, just as Clinton gave this fatal boost to mass black incarceration, Obama gave the supercharge to militarization of police. So therefore, President Obama should be called the militarizer, the police militarizer in chief. But you won't hear that from the Blackness leadership class because they are in league with the militarization of the police. Just last year, 75%, 3 out of 4 black congresspersons voted to give the police the status of a protected class. Now here the police are the most protected class in the whole country. These are people with a license to kill, but the Congressional Black Caucus wants to give them the further protections of being a protected class, like handicapped people, like black people, like women. Now it's the police. So we see that these folks are in league with the further repression of our folks. They're not dillying and dallying and hedging and hawing. They are on the side of the cops with the repressive state apparatus. And so, as we pursue the project to its finish, to free Mumia, Abu-Jamal, and all political prisoners, we should see that project as actually something in our own self-defense, because all of us are now targeted for that gulag. Thank you.
Tell it like it is.